News of a brutal murder is always shocking.
The cordon has gone up around the building. Police said their search was still going on.
He was maybe surprised at the amount of blood that produced.
We know that he's very manipulative and charming.
But when the crime is committed by a cop, it seems even more horrific.
Locals knew the couple had not been getting on, but no one expected anything as vicious as this.
Nobody wants to believe that police officers are criminals.
To die at the hands of the very people sworn to protect us is, for me, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This man has brought shame on the Met.
He's got a very warped moral compass and probably has some sort of power trip, a lust for power.
In his mind, he probably thought, well, I'm a police officer, so I will get away with it.
In this series, I'm going to unravel the outlandish plots, lies and deceit of officers who attempt to get away with murder. On the morning of the 29th of August 2019, Keith Ferguson, a retired detective inspector, was asked by his wife of over 30 years, did he still love her? Less than an hour later, Alice Ferguson would be dead.
Keith's account was that she had fallen out of bed and had a heart attack.
When paramedics arrived, they found Alice's lifeless body and an apparently devastated Keith Ferguson. But was the former cop telling the truth?
Keith has provided all these accounts and they just didn't seem to fit with the circumstances and what he was saying had happened. It just didn't add up.
Alice's untimely death left a community in shock and a mystery that had to be solved. How had the mother of three met her death? And could her ex-police officer husband have been responsible? I've brought together a crack team of experts to try and begin to understand the tragic circumstances around Alice's death. Former Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay, a top anti-corruption officer, psychologist Serena Simmons, and retired detective Howard Groves. With the help of these experts, I'm going to try and unravel what happened in this case and whether Keith Ferguson exploited his knowledge of police techniques to cover up his crime. Former Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay has years of experience investigating cases just like this. She's the first person I need to see to learn more about the Fergusons.
This case is about a cop called Keith Ferguson, who was a Scottish officer. He would have joined policing in the 1980s, and he had a long career in the police and had reached the rank of inspector. He'd retired and had a job as a bus driver. He lived with his wife Alice, and they had by then grown-up children. They'd been married for 33 years.
So could you tell me a little bit about Alice, Keith's wife?
She was completely dedicated to him, to their three children. She was an assistant at the local primary school and absolutely adored by the community and the children, and cared very, very much for making that a good place. Really enjoyed her work, and nobody had a bad word to say about her.
And from what we know, their marriage was a stable one. From the outside looking in, people thought everything was okay at home, there was no signs.
From the outside looking in, it looked like a perfect marriage.
But in August 2019, the apparently harmonious relationship came to an abrupt and tragic end.
Across Aberdeen and North East Scotland, this is Original 106.
The body of a 56-year-old woman has been found at a property in Aberdeen. Police were called to a house on Angusfield Avenue this morning. Officers have not confirmed whether the death is being treated as suspicious.
Alice Ferguson had reportedly died in an accident on the morning of the 29th of August 2019, while she was home with her husband Keith. Keith claimed to have been in the shower at the time when he heard a noise and rushed to their bedroom to find his wife unconscious on the floor. He said he immediately started to perform CPR and called 999. I want to know what the police officers arriving at the couple's home would have faced. So, what do we know what happened on that day?
So we know that about 6:30 in the morning, Keith calls for an ambulance. And what he's saying is that Alice has fallen out of bed and injured herself and stopped breathing. So you might think, well, that happens, not that unusual.
Heart attack or anything like that?
Exactly.
Once paramedics arrive on the scene, they find an unresponsive Alice in the couple's bedroom. Police arrive shortly after the ambulance, and they have some questions for Keith about Alice's injuries.
When the police arrive, he repeats the account and is like, what's the problem? You know, it's quite straightforward. She's fallen. There's nothing to worry about here.
And do you think because of his credentials, and he goes, I was an inspector in the place, they would have maybe believed him more than if it was just Joe Public?
I think they do, and I think that's played out then because they talk to him and look at the scene and think, no, it's all fine.
So they agree with Keith?
So they agree with Keith and they don't think anything suspicious has happened.
Right, wow. Police determined that Alice's death was not suspicious. They believed Keith's story, that Alice had a heart attack and fallen and hit her head. It looked like Keith Farquharson was in the clear. But was he really a grieving husband? Or had he got away with murder? I need more clues into the type of person Keith was. Surely someone with a clean track record, a happy marriage and a good reputation doesn't just suddenly murder their own wife. Local journalist Charlie Gall knew Keith in the years before these tragic events took place. So I'm hoping he can give me some background on the couple's lives and their relationship.
Well, Keith Farquharson was married to Alice. I would have said they had a nice house in Aberdeen, 3 lovely children. He'd risen up to inspector, so the next step up was chief inspector, then superintendent. So he was doing well in his career.
But behind closed doors, Keith had secrets that were about to be revealed and shatter this carefully constructed image, because Keith Farquharson had a dark side.
Keith Farquharson only came to our attention when the misdemeanors came into the public domain. There was no question that he thought he was God's gift to women. He probably used his power over women and thought that he was allowed to get away with a lot of the stuff that he did get away with.
Whilst Alice was devoted to her husband, Keith Farquharson was a serial womanizer.
There was always that issue in the background that he had an eye for the ladies and was regarded by some of the women in the force as a sex pest.
And Keith's inappropriate obsession would soon become public knowledge.
In the media, we weren't privy to what was going on behind closed doors, but the first sort of inkling we got was there was a female traffic warden. Story was leaked that she had been having a fling with senior officers, and Farquharson was one of them.
Caught cheating on Alice and facing the humiliation of his affairs being made public, colleagues may have expected Farquharson's behaviour to improve.
He certainly didn't appear on the face of it to have any shame about what he had done. He didn't crawl away and disappear, far from it. He just carried on.
But an affair is still a far cry from murder. Perhaps Keith was telling the truth about Alice having a heart attack. Or maybe Keith's history of lying should have been a warning for cops. And tragically for Alice, there were other red flags about Keith's behaviour towards women, which went ignored and unpunished. Before his retirement in 2010, Keith Farquharson had a long and accomplished police career. during which he rose to the rank of inspector. But it was a career ultimately tarnished by scandal and abuses of power, including an affair in 2008, something which caused huge distress and humiliation to his ever-loyal and loving wife, Alice. Former Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay spent part of her career investigating bent coppers. She's been looking into Farquharson's career for me.
So we know that in 2008 he'd had an affair that Alice became aware of, and whilst that stopped that relationship, that reignited in 2019. When we go back and look at his policing career, he was what would have been termed in the 1980s as a womaniser, serial womaniser. So he had affairs with different women over the course of his policing career. And he'd also had affairs with 2 other women.
But Keith Farquharson wasn't just having affairs. Behind the scenes, he had a reputation for unsolicited attention towards his female colleagues.
In the 1980s, it was accepted as being one of the lads. That's how you behave, chatting up the women, expected to be the alpha male. He made inappropriate comments to women serving in the police force and was probably quite misogynistic towards them.
So would you say that in the 80s, womaniser, but nowadays, would you see him as like a sexual predator?
Most definitely, yes, a sexual predator. I definitely think the culture and the way things were dealt with in the 80s was completely different. I think we're in a better place now. We know today people are sacked for that sort of behaviour.
But despite his predatory behaviour, at the time, Farquharson was able to continue with his career largely unharmed.
I just wonder in this case whether he thought he was untouchable.
I think it's quite likely that he thought he was untouchable, and that his previous history of not being kicked out of the police force when perhaps he should have been.
I'm surprised that Farquharson was so unconcerned about the consequences of his predatory behaviour. And I'm speaking with psychologist Serena Simmons to understand why he may have felt he could get away with it.
Did his wife know he was having an affair?
Yeah, so sadly we know that his wife was really aware of it. So we can only imagine, really, like any wife in that situation, how she may have felt. She had 3 children at home. She knew her husband was being unfaithful.
Well, a question for me would be, why would she not leave?
Why someone doesn't leave a partner when they're having an affair, when you're someone like Alice, is probably because you value home and family. I think for Alice, what we know of her is she was really a homemaker. She was a mother at heart. In fact, she worked in a school, and the people who worked with her in the school would refer to her as the school mum, because she was a really kind of nurturing character, really cared about the kids. She was an exceptional mother in the home, and that her family were incredibly important to her.
In your opinion, what sort of person would Keith Farquharson have been like in the home, behind closed doors?
I think he would have been the kind of person that needed to be adored. So I think what's really interesting about him is he wanted his kind of wife to be kept there and his children over here while he still was able to have his affairs, because he needed the adoration. He needed the adoration of other women, and that gave him a buzz and an excitement that he just didn't get from home, or sadly from his relationship. And he didn't seek that out in his relationship with his wife either. He kind of needed to do that in other ways.
I've read with this case that people have called Keith Farquharson a narcissist. Can you explain what a narcissist is?
Yeah, so a narcissist is essentially someone who believes, in this case it's easy to describe it as someone who believes the world revolves around them. They are the most important person. What they say goes. They have a very, very inflated sense of self-worth and an ego. And they believe that people should listen to them. What they say goes.
Howard Groves, former Detective Chief Inspector for Scotland Yard, who has worked on numerous high-profile crimes, can see through Farquharson's veneer of respectability.
I don't think I would be unkind to say that within his work environment, he was very much a predator. Within the workplace, there were instances where he had made inappropriate comments as well as providing what was described as a poem, which was quite like a sexual poem that he sent to one of his colleagues.
In 1998, Keith had written a poem that was entitled Gasping for It. The female colleague that he sent it to found it so disturbing that she reportedly couldn't read past the first 2 lines.
She obviously found that inappropriate and complained. He got charged with what I thought was a weird offence, was breach of the peace, and got a £500 fine. That inappropriate behaviour was probably seen by some just to be, a bit of banter, that's what you do, They used to use expressions you would call, people plod and, things like that. So, but the police service has moved on significantly since then. But at that time, that was probably acceptable in certain quarters. There would be certain people who would, and obviously the officer who experienced that, she obviously complained straight away. So it just goes to show you that not everybody signed up to that type of inappropriate behaviour.
Farquharson was also, at that point, demoted in rank. But even though more female officers were making complaints about his unwanted advances and abuses of power, he remained in the police force and was allowed to continue his career.
Yet again, he just carried on. People probably thought, you know what, I'll get in that salacious, inappropriate, predatory behaviour that he had exhibited before came to the fore again. There was an incident an allegation made that he had made inappropriate comments to a motorcycle officer, young female officer. That officer was obviously unhappy with what he had done, and she complained. She decided that she was going to take the force area to an employment tribunal.
As a result, Farquharson was moved into an admin role in a new department. But still, his pattern of abuse and harassment started again. In September 2008, following complaints from multiple women in his new department, Farquharson was put on gardening leave, no longer reporting for duty, but receiving full pay, despite how he treated his female colleagues. He remained on gardening leave until his retirement, when he left the force receiving a full pension, which he then supplemented by becoming a school bus driver. It's little wonder that Keith Farquharson left the police thinking he could get away with anything, even murder.
Keith was very used to kind of sparring with women, getting their attention, getting away with stuff is what he was good at. He was used to initiating affairs and probably initiating them with banter and kind of sussing out what women were available for that kind of thing. I think is really telling of the kind of arrogant, egotistical man that he was. A man like Keith does have a sense of invincibility, but what he probably wasn't aware of was the fact, like a lot of men who have affairs, that sense of invincibility comes from having a secure base. That gives them the strength to go out and to seek experiences and affairs, because they always get to go home to the secure partner who's always there for them and their family unit.
Alice's devotion and loyalty to Keith, in spite of his repeated transgressions, would have reinforced his sense of invulnerability. But could that confidence make him think he could get away with murder? Charlie Gall was reporting the case and remembers how much the news of Alice's death shook the community. He has some more details of the morning of the 29th of August 2019 that may give me some new insight into Alice's final moments.
This is the leafy suburban street where Keith Farquharson, to all intents and purposes, led a quiet family life, the lovely family home where they brought up their 3 children.
But after that day in August, the peaceful suburb the Farquharsons loved would never be the same again.
What happened to Alice Farquharson that fateful morning would have been absolutely unheard of in an area like this. The whole community was shocked and reeling. She was adored around here. It began as a normal day, as I understand it, for Keith Farquharson, who was away to drive the school bus in his new life outside the force. But his wife apparently asked if he still loved her, and he had simply groaned, and that had led to her slapping and scratching him. He then claimed he was in the shower when he heard a clatter or a thud from through in the bedroom. He then said he went through and discovered that his wife had fallen and hit her head off a piece of furniture.
When paramedics and police arrived, Alice's injuries didn't seem entirely consistent with Keith's story. But in a stroke of luck for Farquharson, a couple of the police officers who turned up were well known to him.
His son-in-law turned up at the scene. He was a serving police officer, and other police officers who would probably have known Farquharson from the force days. And he told them this tissue of lies about how she had fallen. It had been an accident in the bedroom. The first officers on the scene gave evidence that Farquharson was agitated, and he seemed like a man who had perhaps just lost his wife. There's no doubt that he tried to manipulate the scene and manipulate the first officers on the scene. Given that he'd also been a high-ranking police officer previously, he probably felt that the younger officers might be in awe of him in some way, and that, again, this is where his power and manipulation would come into it, and he would think he could tell them what they're looking at. And he obviously made a great facade of playing the grieving husband as well.
Given Farquharson's history, I can see why he would be arrogant enough to believe he could get away with it. And it did look like his story was working. But he didn't bargain on one police officer, who was clearly not taken in by his story or his crocodile tears.
Another more senior officer arrived, and he wasn't satisfied that it was a non-suspicious death. I suspect, looking at the scene, having heard what Farquharson's initial account was, probably looked at it and thought, there's something not right. They would also, of course, have known Farquharson's background, his affairs. The whole thing, the whole circumstances, and taking into account Farquharson's previous history on the force, I think would have been enough to persuade them that there's more to be seen here.
The senior officer who had arrived at the scene raised his concerns with CID. He felt this needed to be investigated further, and Farquharson became agitated that his story was being questioned. Eventually, CID determined that there was nothing further to investigate. There was no crime. And Farquharson appeared to be in
examination what had happened to her.
So in a case where someone dies unexpectedly, so they don't have a medical condition and it's not predicted, and they haven't seen a doctor recently, there's routinely a post-mortem's carried out. And there's a difference between a forensic post-mortem where you gather all your forensic evidence and a straightforward examination. So it's a straightforward examination, but when the pathologist is conducting the post-mortem, they're just not happy that actually she has died in the circumstances that are described. And there's indications of strangulation has taken place. And so they flag it, and it goes back to being opened as a police investigation again.
Jim Fraser has studied this case. He has over 40 years' experience working as a forensic investigator, so he knows exactly what the examiner would have been looking for during the post-mortem and what they would have found.
What makes this case sort of tricky to investigate is that it's a very enclosed crime scene and a very enclosed incident. There are no other witnesses. It's not that there's blood or there's weapons. It's also quite difficult to cross-check and corroborate any version of events. I think the paramedics were suspicious. The inspector was definitely suspicious, and I think he was explicit about that. Then along came the CID, so they kind of slowed things down. You would have thought they would have been a bit more alert to it, but it may be, in fairness to them all involved, that this actually all looked very benign. People do die in bed, and, you know, to all intents and purposes, it looks perfectly natural.
It looked like Keith had used his inside knowledge of police investigations to his advantage. It was going to be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of playing a part in Alice's death. Unless, of course, the results of the post-mortem could prove otherwise.
The only way that you can cross-check or corroborate Keith's story is by post-mortem examination of the body, which is why that should have been done as speedily as possible. The purpose of a post-mortem examination is to establish the cause of death. The cause of death may be suspicious or non-suspicious.
At first, there was nothing about the state of Alice's body to indicate anything other than a natural death. But then the forensic pathologist found something she wasn't expecting.
What the forensic pathologist found in this instance was tiny blood vessels called petechiae, and what she described as florid under the eyelids. These are minute blood vessels that burst when a neck is compressed.
Suddenly, the case had changed. Officers could now be certain that Keith was not telling the whole truth. There had in fact been some kind of obstruction of Alice's airway which helped to cause her death. But that still didn't make him guilty. And pathologists still needed to determine what exactly had happened to Alice. After further examination, the pathologist reported that Alice had signs of blunt force trauma, resulting in bruises on her face. Bruises that were likely caused by something or someone gripping her mouth and nose. And the most damning finding of all for Keith, the pathologist said that during Alice's death, something had also been pressing on her neck, preventing her from breathing.
These post-mortem findings are incriminating. The post-mortem findings established that Alice had died by neck compression. The cause of death is strangulation.
Keith's story was a lie. Alice hadn't had a heart attack and fallen. She had in fact been strangled. And now former Inspector Keith Farquharson was a prime suspect in his wife's murder. Had he killed Alice and attempted to use his police knowledge and connections to cover it up?
She had been strangled. The only person who was available to strangle Alice was Keith.
Julie Mackay is a specialist in domestic murder investigations, and I need her expertise as this case becomes even more complex.
Their findings were that she had been strangled, and whilst there wasn't the evidence of this, you've got a bone in your throat called the hyroid bone, which is often broken when somebody is strangled, and in this case that hadn't happened, But there was evidence that her airways had been blocked, so her mouth and nose, and pressure had been applied to her throat and injuries to her chest.
And obviously from that point, she was probably fighting for her life.
Exactly. So that was enough, really, for the questions to be asked and to say, right, we need to get him in.
Investigators now know that Farquharson was lying. Alice had been strangled, and he was the only one who could have done it. Now, I want to know what drove Keith Farquharson to kill his much-loved wife. Was this a premeditated, calculated attack? Or was this a spur-of-the-moment outbreak of violence? Did Keith Farquharson simply snap? And would he ultimately admit to murder? Or would he have a plan to get him out of yet another difficult situation?
Headlines this morning. A 60-year-old man's been arrested in connection with the murder of Alice Farquharson. The 56-year-old was found dead in her home in Aberdeen yesterday.
Alice Farquharson had died on the morning of the 29th of August 2019. Her death had initially been ruled as non-suspicious, the result of a heart attack which had caused her to fall, hitting her head. But then, the coroner's report came back. The post-mortem showed that she'd been strangled, and her husband, Keith Farquharson, a former police inspector, was the only person around that could have done it. Keith Farquharson was arrested for the murder of his wife, Alice. In custody, he was interviewed about his involvement in Alice's death. But after decades of getting away with abusing his power, Keith Farquharson still wasn't ready to take responsibility for his actions.
So when he comes into custody, he does change his story and he says, well, what's happened is she's asked him if he loves her still, and they've had a bit of an argument, and she's lashed out, scratching him. And then he sort of says, well, it was a self-defense thing, you know, he's pushed her away and she's suffered a heart attack. Her heart has stopped beating, effectively, and it's not a heart attack in the traditional sense. But as a result of their argument, and there's a bit of struggle, you know, she's undergone this cardiac arrest.
Keith had now changed his story, admitting that he was in the room when Alice died, rather than in the shower, as he initially had claimed. He admitted that they had argued and there'd been a struggle, but he was still adamant that he had not killed her. Instead, he claimed she suffered a heart attack during their fight.
There's a big legal argument around the circumstances of the death and whether effectively she's died, her heart stopped beating as a result of the strangulation, or whether that was just something that happened because of the stress of the situation.
The case went to trial in February 2020 at the High Court in Glasgow, with Keith Farquharson maintaining his innocence. But would the jury buy his story? I want to know if it's really possible that Alice could have died of a heart attack, as Keith was still insisting when he went to trial. Or was this just more lies from a former police inspector used to getting his own way?
Keith Farquharson phoned the emergency services in the early hours of a weekday morning, saying that he thought his wife had had a heart attack. Paramedics would have seen possibly hundreds of people who have had heart attacks, so they're very familiar with what a heart attack looks like. But his wife also had abrasions to her face. She was lying outside the bed. These are not necessarily typical findings of somebody who has had a heart attack. In these circumstances, if she had a heart attack, there would be visible signs in her heart. It's what they call gross pathology. They get the heart and they cut it into slices, and they look at each slice, and you will see damage to the heart. When you have a heart attack, an infarct, you get patches on the inside surface of the heart. The pathologist would recognise and establish that.
So what about Alice's post-mortem? Would that in any way support Keith's story of a heart attack during a struggle?
The findings in this case were that there were certainly no signs of a heart attack,
The pathologists had found signs of asphyxiation that they would not expect to see if Alice had in fact died of a heart attack. The investigation into Alice's death could determine with certainty that Alice had died from strangulation, not a heart attack. The investigation was now conclusive. Keith's new story was a complete fiction. Alice had not died of a heart attack as a result of either the struggle or through stress about her marriage. She had been strangled to death. But were there any signs to suggest that this was premeditated murder or a moment of uncontrollable violence?
The turning point would have been the post-mortem and the report that was produced by the pathologist to say that her neck had been compressed, that her airways had been blocked, and that she had blunt trauma across her body. That is completely, you would not have expected if she just had a heart attack, because he obviously tried to give the implication.
With forensic investigators and police now sure of the cause of death, would Keith finally admit to what he had done and why he had done it?
Now, with the ego that Keith has, he's not going to tell us anything that makes him vulnerable. So Keith says that she had said, do you love me, or something along those lines about feeling a sense of love from him. I personally don't believe that that's what she said on that morning, because someone like him wouldn't tell us what she really said, especially if it implicated him in some way or made him look small or made him look vulnerable. Someone who has spent his whole life not telling the truth, why would we believe the words he spoke?
With the new evidence and Keith still maintaining his wife's death was not his fault, his defence team took a chance to get Keith a lower sentence.
They were going to give him an opportunity to plead to culpable homicide. In other words, saying, I'm culpable because I was responsible for her injuries, which resulted in her death, but I didn't mean to do it.
So they give him an opportunity here
to plead to a lesser
offence.
Even in his new defence, Keith persisted in his delusion that the story of Alice's accidental death would be believed, despite all the evidence mounting against him. But the prosecutor determined that this plea was unacceptable. There was too much evidence that Keith had murdered Alice and then attempted to cover up his crime by lying to the police and paramedics. The culpable homicide plea was rejected.
So that was it. Once the decision had been made, it would be full steam ahead as far as a criminal investigation would take place.
And he was then a suspect of murder.
Keith would now be tried for murder. In the confines of the court, Keith was able to tell his own version of events to try and convince the jurors of his innocence. In his arrogance and narcissism, he must have thought that having lied for so long and got away with it, he could continue to do so with impunity. Maybe psychologist Serena Simmons can give me some insight into how she thinks a former police officer entrusted with public protection could commit such an awful crime and be so deluded as to think he could get away with it.
I think on the morning that he killed her, something happened, something was said that triggered him to take the opportunity to do what he did. For all we know, she said something about leaving him or I'm unhappy. That may have been too much for him and he wanted to stop her from speaking. I don't have to be with her, I can get rid of her, or at least I can stop her talking. He held his hand over her mouth, very telling. The words that she spoke, though, we will never know whether they are the words that she actually spoke on that morning.
Police were thinking the same as Serena. Keith's story still didn't add up, and a clear pattern of behaviour had emerged which suggested that whether premeditated or not, there was a very obvious motive for his actions. To try and make sense of it, they'd started to tie his past behaviour to the case. In particular, one of his affairs in 2008.
I think he had rekindled a previous relationship. He'd refused to give up the PIN number for his phone. He was just being awkward, trying to probably delay the inquiry. He would have wanted to maybe scrub his phone But they did get hold of the phone, and sadly there was even messages on the phone from his wife where she'd been pleading with him, you know, love messages, but also there was evidence of other women that he'd been in contact with.
Police found messages that were sexual in nature on Farquharson's phone. It's thought that Farquharson had rekindled his affair from 2008, and Alice may have found out and confronted him, leading to the pair having a struggle that resulted in Alice's death. Though he was now on trial for murder, Keith maintained his story with a few subtle alterations. He now claimed that Alice had asked him if he loved her, and when he groaned in response, she attacked him first. He claimed he had only acted in self-defence, that a struggle ensued, and that Alice had died of natural causes. He stuck to this story despite the overwhelming evidence of the post-mortem. He would plead not guilty to all charges. But it didn't work. After decades of abusing his position, Keith Farquharson finally got his comeuppance.
On the 23rd of March in 2020, he was sentenced in the court to 15 years imprisonment. And what that means is he must serve 15 years, but it's a life sentence. So he'll always be what we call a life licensee. It just means he won't be released for 15 years.
So he's not eligible for parole until 15 years, and then it'll be reviewed then?
Absolutely.
But to Keith, who had spent a lifetime abusing his power and somehow managing to get away with it every time, this must have been a rude awakening for the former copper.
He feels hard done by. He didn't kill her, it was her fault for challenging him, and she shouldn't have. So I think he did think he was going to get away with it because of his arrogance, and he'd got away with it effectively before, hadn't he? So, not killing, obviously, but bad behaviours before.
Wow. Keith Farquharson was a man who, over the course of his career, constantly abused his role as a trusted and decorated officer to harass and degrade women. All the warning signs were there that he should never be trusted. Finally, justice has been served.
He was a predator at work. He had extramarital affairs. Alice was aware of them. There was a fight between her and him, and he obviously took it to the nth degree, and she was killed.
That he would have done that and then tried to cover it up. Cowardice, really, but you often find that with the sort of philandering, cheating, serial cheats, that you know, they're cowards at heart as well. I think he was brought up in that era where he felt he could do whatever he wanted.
I don't think this was a premeditated thing. I don't think he got up that morning thinking he was going to kill her. And she definitely did not deserve to die as a result of him having affairs with other women, because that's what it boils down to.